Hello! In this episode I'm going to be covering how to create some common materials using the Redshift standard material shader. Now this episode is aimed at those who are new to cinema and just starting out using Redshift, so you're going to need to have Redshift in order to follow along with this tutorial. I'm going to start by covering a couple of topics within the Redshift documentation, then I'm going to follow up with a couple of project settings that you need to have set up, and then I'll go over the scene setup which I've got here, and then we can start moving on to materials. And when it comes to materials, I'm going to go over some of the basic parameters to get the bare bones essentials when it comes to creating materials. I'm not going to go through every parameter because otherwise we're going to be here all day. There's a lot to cover in that, so I'm just going to go through the ones which should give you enough information to create the majority of materials. So let's start with the documentation. Just going to Cinema 4D, and you see here we've got this getting started on the first page. So if we go into that, you can see within the table of contents there is a creating a Redshift material tab, and if we click on that, it brings us to this area which says how to create a Redshift material. It shows us how to create one, how to apply it to an object and various presets that you can use. However, I noticed as I was glancing through this, it's using a deprecated shader. This material shader is no longer being supported as far as I'm aware. So if I were to search material just to find this shader, go to the material shaders here, you can see we've got legacy shaders, and within that we've got that material shader. So if I click on that, it says this shader is deprecated, please use the standard material instead. So we're going to be using that throughout this tutorial. However, if you're stuck with that material shader, you can find all the individual parameters here and the details about them within this documentation. So if you want to learn more about that, you can find information there. However, since I'm going to be using the standard material, I'm not going to be covering any of that. If you want to find out more information about the standard material, again, you can find that in the documentation as well, and it goes through each of the parameters in thorough detail, if you can make sense of it, that is. I'm planning to look at future tutorials in which I go into more details about each of the properties, but for this episode I'm just going to go through some of the basic parameters to give you enough to create most common materials. Okay, so the next part was to do with the project settings. First of all, you want to click on this edit render settings icon here and make sure your renderer is set to Redshift, which I've got here. The next one is to make sure that you have this Redshift tab here, and if you don't have this here, all you need to do is go into Edit, Preferences, Renderer, Redshift, and then toggle on this Redshift main menu. If you toggle it off, it disappears, and if you toggle it on, it reappears. So we need this. Okay, now the scene setup. I'm using a setup which I created in a previous tutorial called a quick and simple scene setup, and I'll post a link to that somewhere on here. But what's going on is basically I've got this backdrop curtain with a very diffused white material, so it's not going to pick up too many highlights or anything like that. And then for the light, I'm using a dome light with a HDRI texture. And that's basically going to project a 360 high dynamic range texture into the scene, so then this object has something to reflect in terms of the environment. It can reflect an environment, and then with the light information from the HDRI, we're going to be receiving light information to cast light into the scene as well. So it just gives us more, enough detail to work with when it comes to creating textures. Okay, so now we've covered that, what we want to do is go into the material manager panel, which to me looks like a smiling cyclops, but I don't know what it's meant to be. It's some sort of sphere or ball on a curve. But yeah, click on this, you get the material manager. Inside that, you click create, Redshift, materials, and then standard. Okay, and then from here we need to go into the node editor. So in order to do that, we just select the material, go into the basic tab, and click node editor. However, you can just double click the material and it will also bring you to the node editor. Okay, and once we go into here, what we're greeted with are two nodes. the RS standard material and output. Now to navigate this, it's the same as Espresso and the 2D view in viewport. You can hold 1 and click and drag to move around, 2 to click and drag and zoom in, and then that's pretty much it, or whatever other hotkeys you use for navigating the other viewports. Okay, so this RS standard material, this is where we create the material that we want, and then we plug that into the surface of this output. So when we place this material on an object, its surface will be controlled by, well, whatever material we create will be placed on that object's surface. So we're going to place this material on this object here. Now you can click and hold the material, and you can either drag it onto the object in the scene, or you can drag it onto the object in the objects manager, which is what I'm going to do. And I highly recommend doing this as good practice, because if you drag that material onto the object in the scene, there's a chance that it ends up going on a different object instead. It happens too often, so I'll just plug it onto the objects in the object manager so you know exactly where that material is going. Okay, the next step is to make sure we can actually preview what we're seeing, because this viewport won't give us an accurate representation of what's going on in this material that we're creating. So we need to go to Redshift, RS Renderview. It should bring up something like this. I'm going to drag mine to the side over here because you don't need what was behind this. And I'm going to hit play. I'm going to give it a few seconds. Just give it a few seconds to load. Okay, that'll do. I'm going to scroll in a bit as well so we can see more. What we get is this grey sphere, because the default settings is this grey plasticky sort of material. Okay, so the first thing we're going to go cover is this base category. We're going to go through the colour and metalness. We're going to skip the other ones because otherwise, again, we'll be here forever. So with the colour, if I set this to red and hit the IPR, what we should get is this red material here. Okay, that's great. So what the base colour does is essentially it controls the colour of the material. There are some caveats to that, because when it comes to things like glass and dielectric, I'd say glass subsurface scattering, certain materials wouldn't use the base colour to control its colour, but for most cases this is what you'd use to control the colour of an object. The next one is metalness. So if I set this to 1 and run the IPR, what we get is a fully metal material. So what the metalness does is what it says on the tin, pretty much. With the metalness at 1, which is 100%, you'll end up with a fully metal object. And with the metalness set to 0, you end up with an object which isn't metal. So if I run this again, there we go, we got our plastic sphere again. Okay, so that's the base category covered. Now we're going to move on to reflection. And the first parameter we're going to go cover is this roughness here, reflection roughness. So if I set this to 0, what we get is this very crisp reflection. I'm going to set the colour back to grey for now. Then press it again. Okay, so we've got the grey material back. What we can see is that we're getting some very crisp reflections here. There's no roughness affecting the reflection, so we're getting a very unrealistic, completely pristine reflection. I mean, ignore the noise from the IPR, but if this were to be rendered properly, we just have pure reflection there, which is not realistic. You'd always have at least a little bit of roughness. However, you could keep this for stylistic purposes, so you know you can do what you want really, but if you're trying to make something photorealistic, you never have roughness set to 0. If we set this to the default settings, 0.2, we run the IPR again, what we get is the same reflection. We're getting the same amount of information in terms of lighting and details, except those details are just being blurred. So the definition of those details are kind of being dispersed or spread across the surface of this object as we increase this roughness. So basically increasing the roughness makes the surface more rough, essentially. It roughens up the reflections. So if we were to set this to about 0.4, then hit the IPR, we end up with something more like possibly a painted wall or something like that. Something where it's a little bit shiny. It's still got all the reflection there, all the information of the environment around it. It's just been spread across the surface rather than retaining those detailed, crisp edges of the reflection. And if you increase the roughness to something crazy like 1, you end up with an incredibly diffused object. All the information from the reflection is there. It's just being dispersed and spread across the surface of the object. Okay, so I'm going to set that back to 0.2. And I'm going to cover IOR briefly, because I'm going to come back to this one as well. Now, according to the Redshift documentation, IOR shouldn't really go anywhere beyond 2.4 something. I think, let's see what it says. We're in reflection. Scroll down to IOR. 2.42. Okay. Yeah, most values range between 1, which is air at room temperature, and 2.42, which is diamond. I'm going to come back to these values in a moment, but yeah, just bear that in mind. However, if you want to, you can go beyond that if you want. So if I went to set this to 6, and I hit the IPR, we end up with this very chromy looking material. This isn't, well, as far as I'm aware, this isn't how you create metallic materials now. You should be using the Metalness. However, this used to be one way in the past to kind of cheat that look, pretty much. I'm just going to pause the IPR again. Now, if you were to use this to create some sort of metallic look without it actually being metal, this technically would be a dielectric material rather than a metal one. I'm just going to turn off the base color because you wouldn't use base color in this scenario. Actually, I'm going to set it to red. So it's the same red we had before. Here we go. So we got some weird red speckles in it, but not the same as what we were getting with the Metalness. Now in this scenario, what we'd be using is the reflection color instead. So I'm going to pause the IPR, set the base color to black, and then set the reflection color to red. And now if I hit the IPR, we end up with this very vibrant red shiny material. I don't think this would be classed as metallic, but maybe some sort of coating, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, that's one way to get some sort of strange metallic looking material without using the Metalness slider, if that's needed for whatever reason. Okay, so I'm going to pause the IPR. I'm going to set those back to the default settings. So we're going to have the white reflection, 1.5 IOR, and set the base material to grey again. Okay, so we're going to come back to the IOR in a moment. Next one is transmission. Now this one, if we set the weight to 1, what we get is a glass material. So I'm just going to place in the IPR. As you can see, we're getting this nice glass material now. I'm going to pause this and create a cube just for the sake of demonstration, because you can't really see anything. Like the background's the same as everything around it. You can't really tell if it's transparent or not. So I'm going to get this cube, put it behind it, so you can see a bit of it. And then I'm going to create another standard material. I'm just going to give it a red material just so we can really see it. That'll do. Okay, go back in the camera, go back to our previous material. Cool. I'm going to hit the IPR again. As you can see, we're getting the cube being refracted up here. Now bear in mind this isn't a hollow glass sphere, this is just one big ball of, well in this case I guess it'd be glass. It could be a different substance, but it looks more like glass to me. It's a transparent substance which isn't hollow. So in this case, think of it as a crystal balls kind of thing. And as you can see, we've got the red cube refracting up here. Now if we change the IOR, if we set it to 1, now remember from what we read in the documentation, an IOR of 1 is the same as what you'd have for air at room temperature. And now you don't physically see air, do you? So if I turn this on now, it's disappeared. Now the object is there, it's just that the light rays that are hitting it are just passing straight through the object. It's not refracting, so we're not seeing any of the refraction that should be taking place because there's nothing refracting. So I'm going to pause the IPR again. I'm going to set this to 1.33, which is the value for water when it comes to index of refraction. So what we should get if we hit the IPR now is something similar or akin to a giant water droplet. So if we let this run for a few seconds, here we go. And the reflection, or sorry, the refraction is a lot different to what we had before. I'm just going to take a snapshot of that so we can come back to it in a moment and compare, because now I'm going to set this to, what was the 2.42 for diamond, so we're going to make this into the same IOR as diamond, 2.42. It was that, wasn't it? Yeah, already forgot, I'd literally just read it as well. Okay, we're going to run this and see what happens. As you can see here, we're getting a much more dense looking transparent material. It's no longer looking like a water droplet, it's looking more crystalline, like, well, as hard as diamond without it actually being diamond. And if I take a snapshot of that and just compare what we had before to what we have now, you can see that this cube is now like it's moved in the refraction. You see more of the environment in this one as well, whereas in the water one you didn't really see much. Now one way to think of the IOR, or the way I've kind of thought about it over the years, is that the thicker, like think of the glasses on the lenses in glasses. If you have thicker lenses, you know, if you look at someone who's wearing thick lensed glasses, usually the eyes bulge a bit or kind of magnify a bit. That's one way to think of IOR. If you increase the value of the IOR, you end up with that magnification, that bulging, that distortion kind of being emphasized. Then, like, think of, it's kind of like a way of introducing thicker glass without actually making the glass any thicker. So if you've got an object which is glass and you need to keep it the depth of that glass at a certain length, or certain depth, sorry, but you want it to refract more, you can increase the IOR instead of increasing the thickness of the glass. I'm not sure if I entirely explained that well, but that's kind of what works for me. Maybe you'll find a way of describing it that kind of clicks for you, but that's what clicked for me anyway. I just think of it as yeah, I just refer to lenses in glasses and the thickness of those and the distortion that those cause. Anyway, I'll move on to the next topic before I confuse you anymore. So I'm going to set the IOR back to 1.5. I'm going to turn off the transmission weight. So what we should get is a plastic grey sphere again. I'm just going to check. There we go. Yeah, we've got the plastic grey sphere. I'm going to skip subsurface for now, same with sheen, thin film and coat, just because I don't think I'm going to be able to do much justice in this one. I could do subsurface, but it's just going to take a while to cover everything. I'm just going to do a quick skim through emission and then jump to opacity and then bump. Okay, so for the opacity, emission, what I'm going to do is, it's already set to white, so I'm going to set the weight to 1. What that's going to do is make this object emit a white light at a value of 1. So if I run this, you can see we've got this big bright light now. And this function is slightly different to how lights work. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it basically kind of works with the global illumination. It's creating light into the environment and stuff, but it doesn't share the exact same properties as how a light would work. You can increase this value, so you can go to say 4, and it'll start to blow out even more light. So you can see the object itself even got brighter and it's emitting more light into the scene. However, there is a point where if you increase the light too much, you can end up with fireflies occurring in shadows and the rest of the scene, and that can increase render times, and in some cases even the highest render times won't completely clear out the fireflies and noise. So you do have to be careful with relying on this too much. In some cases you need to just use lights and then use something else for this material. So we're going to set that back down so we get our plastic grey sphere again. Yep, so we're back to this. And I'm going to go to opacity now. Okay, so in here, let's close all these other tabs, get a bit messy. Okay, opacity. Now white is a default, which means we have full opacity on this light, it's completely opaque. If we set this to black, it's going to make the object completely invisible. There you go. And if we were to go into the material and change the opacity to 50%, it would be 50% opaque. So I'm just going to close that, hit the IPR. There we are. Now, as you can see, I mean, we've already covered glass and transparent materials, so we wouldn't be using opacity for anything like that. However, opacity does come in really handy when it comes to dealing with image sprites, things like that. So I'm just going to go into, well, I'm going to create a node now. I'm going to create a noise shader. So I'm going to go to create, add nodes, and it brings up this panel. Now, the first thing I'd recommend doing whenever you use this is to select this pin icon, because if you don't and you click somewhere else, it disappears and it's incredibly frustrating. So create, add nodes, and select this pin. Now if you click off it, it'll stay there. Now another way to get to this window is to just double click in the node editor and it'll bring one up. So what I'm going to do is search for noise. I'm going to use this one here, max on noise, because this one in the legacy, as far as I'm aware, this is just here for backwards compatibility, and I can imagine this will end up becoming redundant or deprecated at some point, so I'd suggest using max on noise from this point onward. Okay, so we're going to take this, and what we get is, if I plug this directly into the output so we can see what's happening with this material, I'm just going to hit the IPR. And what we get is the raw black and white information from the max on noise. We're not dealing with any reflections or shadows or anything from the shader, the standard material, because we've not actually plugged that in. We've just got this direct black and white information from this noise. I'm going to change this noise type to something with a bit more contrast. I'm going to go for this nutus. I don't know how to pronounce this one. Nutus? Anyway. Just going to see what this looks like, and you can see we're getting a lot more contrast, a lot more variation, and it's, you know, you can see a lot more going on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into the opacity and then plug the standard material into the surface. Now what this is going to do is, if you remember, the white value in the opacity meant that the object was fully opaque, you could see the object, and then the black values in opacity meant you couldn't see the object at all. So with this max on noise plugged in, the white patches here will be visible and all the black patches will make the object invisible. So if we run this now, you can see that's what's happened. Now this comes in handy again when it comes to like image sprites. So say for example you were dealing with a leaf texture and you had it on a plane. Now obviously you want the leaf to appear on the plane, but you don't want the rest of the plane to appear, you just want the leaf. And you don't want to be cutting out the leaf from the plane geometry because that would be a nightmare to deal with. So you can use a texture to say we just want the leaf to be visible, make that part white, and then the background or the rest of the texture would be black to say we don't want to see the rest of this plane object, we just want to see the leaf. So it's good for cutting out parts of geometry without actually having to physically cut out the geometry. Okay, now using this noise shader, we're going to start using it for the bump map, and this will be the last one that we use, the last parameter that we cover in this episode, because otherwise we're going to be here for a very long time. So let's go in here and search for bump. I'll go into more detail about bump in a follow-up video, so don't worry if I don't explain too much about it. But we need this in order for the bump map to work. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to click and drag this node and release it in an empty part of this box. And it'll give us options to work with. So we go for inputs, texture, we want to go to input. Now the settings here, they're all fine by me. If you want to make this, what this is going to be doing is adding bump to the material. So if you want more bump, you can increase the height scale. However, this can only take you so far, and again I'll cover this in a follow-up video as to what you can do to introduce more bump. So I'm going to plug this in. I'm going to take this out of the opacity because we don't want that. I'm going to make sure the opacity is white as well. Okay, so now when we run this, we should just get the same grey sphere we had before, but with bumps on it. There we go. So with the bumps, basically we're taking the white information from the max on noise and using that to drive the bumps on the surface of this material. Now it is a shading trick, it's not actually altering the geometry, and this is incredibly useful when it comes to fine details like pores on skin and small cracks on say like worn painted surfaces and things like that, and details in wood. But again, when it comes to incredible detail, you end up looking at things like using normals and displacement, which I'll cover in a follow-up video. So yeah, I'm hoping this has helped you. These parameters should allow you to create a lot of the basic materials, and again in some cases you may want to use a texture instead of a max on noise. So I'll just quickly show you what you can do there. You're just going to create, add nodes, and then you can either search texture or you can go to this texture tab here. Then in here we've got texture, and you can see you've got the max on noise there as well, and other nodes which I won't cover in this episode. Again, I'm going to wrap this up fairly soon. But in here you can get a texture, and then in here all you need to do is go into the general tab, image, and then here you've got the path, and you can search for an image. So I'm going to go and use one which I'm going to be using in a follow-up video. And it'll ask if you want to put this in the project that you've got set up. I'm going to say no because I don't want to be creating copies of the same material. But now if we drag this into the material color and hit the IPR, what we'd get is that material controlling the color of that object. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I'm going to go into more detail about some of the other parameters in a follow-up video and show you how to unpack a texture pack from Polyhaven to reconstruct the material from there. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If there's anything that you want me to cover in the future, let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It will help the channel a lot. It means I can create more content. Yeah, and if you enjoyed it, great. Hope you have a wonderful day, and hopefully see you in the next one.